Welcome to what is our last session today in the Conference of the Trees at the New York Times Climate Hub. I think we've had a really enriching afternoon. I hope you agree. And this last session will be, I think, equally enriching. It is called Systems Change, Sustainable Innovations Powering the Great Transformation. And this is a session that we are very pleased to bring to you because it's part of our Climate Innovations series with whom we've been partnering with Edinburgh University. And it is being supported very generously by Siemens Energy. So we're just going to play a very brief video and then we'll start the session. Thank you.
A world without electricity is unimaginable. People take it for granted. We have to protect the planet from ourselves. My name is Sindre Tungesvik. I am an electrical engineer at the Offshore Marine Center in Trondheim. We deliver electrical power systems for the offshore marine market. The electrical ferry is the perfect example of the energy transition. These are vessels that do not have the possibility to reduce their emissions. With the battery systems, we can actually put greenhouse gas emissions to zero in operation. When you have those minutes of silence in the woods, you really appreciate what you have. This is something we have to protect.
Warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Isha Nelson, my fabulous colleague at the New York Times, and some fantastic innovators. Please give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll give a second for everyone to take their seats. We've got a full panel for you this afternoon. So, as Stephen was mentioning, this session is really amazing because everyone on it has been chosen as part of a program with the University of Edinburgh as climate change innovators. So out of well over 200 applicants already picked from the most innovative people, 16 were chosen to be part of the New York Times Climate Hub and give us an opportunity to hear more about their work and what they've been up to. So I'm just really, really delighted that you can have you here today. I feel like well over a week of panels in where we've been talking a lot about the importance of innovation, the importance of climate change adaptation and mitigation. It's going to be really great to hear from people who are, doing the real work and can tell us what it's like to try and grow a company and whether it's access to financing, whether it's scaling, what those challenges and growth opportunities are like. So because there are a few of you, and we have Reto on screen with us too, I'm just going to ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves to everyone, and then we'll dive into a round of questions. So Florence, I'm actually going to start with you.
Great. Thanks for having me here. My name is Florence, and I'm the CTO and co-founder of Lixea. The big challenge that we're trying to solve is to decouple the chemical industry, the fuel industry, materials industry from petroleum. So what we're doing is using waste wood from construction, for example, but also agricultural residues, and separating the naturally occurring components so we can then make them readily usable input materials to produce, for example, bioethanol, but also bioplastics, or even clothing fibers.
Great. Yeah. Let me ask you one quick follow-up question for those of us who haven't taken a science class in a while. What are some of those products used for?
Yeah, bioethanol is a transport fuel that we're probably familiar with. One of the components in wood is called lignin. It can be used as a resin in plywood, for example, to make new furniture. And there's also cellulose is a very widely used component of wood that can be turned into viscose fibers, for example. So those of you who pay attention to the material that your shirt is made of, for example, might be familiar with that. So it's really, those are all components. A lot of them we're already using in our daily lives, but they have the potential to be used in many more applications. So if you brought the coffee today, the lid was made of polylactic acid. That is a plastic that is currently made from sugar, that comes from food sources. but we can also produce that from the sugar that is naturally occurring in wood in the form of cellulose, and therefore also not only shift away from petroleum, but also shift the existing bioplastics industry, for example, from using food-grade sources to non-food sources or to waste sources.
Great, thanks for this. Edward, do you want to go next?
So I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at Matera, and we help the fashion industry reduce its environmental impact. And we develop hardware and software systems to grow radically more sustainable cotton. So it's in 30% of all textiles, so I'm assuming most people here will have some cotton that they wear, and the agricultural systems under which they're grown are under threat right now because of climate change. So we're developing systems that will help farmers both mitigate their impact and adapt. We're currently piloting in Gujarat, India, where our systems can grow using up to 80% less water compared to neighboring farms, pesticide-free, whilst increasing yields quite substantially. So using land more efficiently and profitably for the farmers as well.
Great. Kristen?
I'm Kristen. I'm one of the co-founders of Sati, and at Sati we make biodegradable and compostable sanitary pads from banana and bamboo fiber. We're also based in Gujarat as well, in India, and we are working to address the lack of access to menstrual hygiene products, but in a sustainable way. We have all of our kind of impacts are built into our supply chain, so we work with an all-women staff in our manufacturing unit, and we also work with farmers to source our raw materials as well.
Okay. I mean, we have 2 companies based in the same place, but I should say that out of the 16, there were 11 countries involved. We just happen to have both of you on this panel with us. Reto, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as well?
Yes, a warm welcome from Switzerland. Hello, Glasgow. My name is Reto Schmid. I'm co-founder and CEO of Julia. Julia is a company that focuses on hot water, or more or less on the heat of the hot water, the shower hot water. And we have developed a shower drain that looks like that. So here you can see a cross-section of that. And we recycle the heat from the used shower water to preheat the incoming cold water. So with the newest models, we can recycle up to 50% of the otherwise lost heat. And that makes fully sense because these days, hot water uses in new builds the same amount of energy as the entire space heating. So when everybody's focused on the building envelope, we focus on the last chink in the armor, which is the hot water drain.
Great. Reto, can you show us that drain again? I feel like we only got a quick glimpse of it. Let's get a little show and tell going.
Okay. So here, this is a cross-section. From the top, it looks like that, like a standard ordinary drain. And the famous, or the special thing is that this drain has a cold water inlet and the cold water outlet on the other side. So while you're showering, hot water flows through the green siphon here, drops over this heat exchanger. These are double-walled safety tubes. And yes, so the heat flows through the siphon. The hot water drops over these heat exchanger tubes. These are getting warm. And because the cold water is connected to the drain, the heat will be used for preheating the cold water. And because of that, cold water isn't cold at your mixer. It's already 30 degrees warm. And because of that preheating, we need less from the hot water side. So it's a very basic stuff. Only heat exchanger in your shower outlet, and this can save up to 50% of the energy.
Amazing. Chris, next.
Thank you. My name is Chris Davis. I'm the founder and CEO of Harvest London. Harvest London is a vertical farming company based in London, and we are working with food manufacturing, restaurants, chefs to transform the sustainability of the food supply chain. As you've seen from COP, agriculture takes over 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Of that, 50% is due to the transport of food. In this country, 75% of all fruit and veg is imported, mostly from the EU. So because of vertical farming techniques allowing us to put vertical farms indoors, close to our cities, we're able to massively reduce the food mileage necessary to cater to our cosmopolitan tastes. If we compare vertical farming to traditional agriculture, vertical farms have the potential of producing 350 times the amount of produce in the same amount of space, using 95% less water, 95% less fertilizer, and 100% pesticide free. And if we're going to feed the billions of people that we're going to have on this planet by 2050, there needs to be a fundamental change in terms of how food is produced and how everyone is getting fed.
Just give us a sense, if I'm going to walk into a vertical farm, what am I looking at?
So vertical farming is the practice of growing indoors under LEDs using hydroponic technology. So we grow in water, not soil. And you'll essentially see racking, where we are able to grow plants one on top of the other, thereby being very, very space efficient. And by the fact that we use LEDs, we can grow 365 days of the year while doing that very, very locally.
And what kind of stuff are you growing?
At the moment, we do a lot of herbs, leafy greens. We tend to focus on the stuff that has to come from very far away, right? We all enjoy the Thai curry and the Mexican burrito, and we're not going to give up these cosmopolitan tastes. What we say is that vertical farming gives us the opportunity of catering to those cosmopolitan tastes, not at the expense of sustainability.
Okay, Nassif, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Hi everyone, I'm Nassif. I'm the founder of Reshift, and we help small businesses get to net zero. So our product Zero Carbon helps businesses in 3 ways. The first one is it offers a free carbon dashboard for all the small businesses that are working with us. The second part is our net zero policy building software, which is integrated into our existing platform, will help businesses navigate without an expensive consultant working with them. And the third part is to identify and compare their own supply chains and help them make the right decisions at the end of the day.
Thank you. So I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. Obviously, there's lots of different companies here, so do keep those in mind, and I'll definitely come to you all in the audience for questions in a little bit. But first, Florence, I just want you to talk to us a little bit about the process to get here, the process for you to have your pilot project in Sweden. You said it's it's like a very long research journey to be able to do this. So just talk us through a little bit of that history.
Yeah, so developing a chemical process is extremely time consuming. So we spun out from Imperial College 4 years ago. Before that, there was already probably about 10 years of research going into this. So it starts, as many scientific discoveries do, it started with a bit of luck, a discovery that happened by accident. Someone forgot to dry their solvent, and it turned out that the presence of water that was taken up from the atmosphere did magic. So we filed patents, or my co-founders did. I then also joined doing my PhD on this, and after that, or during this time when I was doing my PhD, we really thought, it would be so silly if this didn't actually go any further. So we founded a company. At the beginning, it was, it's very difficult to raise money for something like this. We need a lot of money to build actual pilot plants, pipes, vessels, pumps. It also takes a very long time, so a lot of VC firms aren't willing to take that risk and time horizon. So at the beginning, very much with grant funding, we were able to do a bit of testing using open access facilities. So there are a few of those in Europe, places that have reactors, etc., that you can rent yourself into. And then we now have a very large European grant that is allowing to build us our pilot plant. So it's our equipment is on its way. It should go online early next year. But it's a very time-consuming undertaking, and I think for us what really made a difference were grants, and I think the government really has a strong role to play to make sure that these kind of innovations are given a chance before it becomes relevant for corporates, for example, to take on the technology risk, etc. Yeah,
I mean, for those of us who were here last week, there was Finance Day on Wednesday, right? So there was private banks, insurers, pension funds kind of saying, we have the capital, we want to align to net zero goals. But I'm hoping we could just talk a little bit more about that access to financing for those of you who are trying to do projects that have very long-term ambitions. I think there is a huge sense of action needs to be taken, demand needs to be taken, but there's a long process involved in some of this. And so how do you go about, what would your message be to some of these organizations who say, we want to fund this stuff, but we don't know how to find the projects, we don't know where they are, we're not sure they're going to scale, we don't know if we want to take the risk. I mean, have any of you been successful in getting around that challenge?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think from our perspective, it's certainly been hard, and I think from having this conversation, what we all agree on is that most sustainable startups, most sustainable businesses tend to skew very capital intensive in the first place. And finding the right investor that has the long-term view and the long-term horizon, enabling us to build further farms and scale the production necessary to scale, it is a huge challenge. We've been lucky enough to be able to find some investors who really consider vertical farming to be, and vertical farms themselves, to be the next wave of sustainable infrastructure projects, right? So the investors that we speak to are the people that are already invested in solar farms and wind farms and anaerobic digesters. And support from the government, rightly or wrongly, is decreasing in some of those industries because they've enjoyed support from the government for 10, 15 years. So we're looking for the same kind of support for these newer technologies with that same 10 to 15 to 25-year horizon.
I think also just adding to that, for the sector-specific nature of everything that we do, we're starting to see, I guess, investment groups will look to kind of the first person to take that brave step, right? And in an industry, our main customers is the fashion industry. We need those sorts of companies to show that they're willing to kind of invest in us in a way that won't block us from being competitive as we grow, to show that there is that kind of market demand, and that is a de-risking strategy for other investors. So that's been quite critical in our sense, is making sure that demand is shown in a concrete and tangible way, so that investors feel comfortable that, okay, there might be a tech risk or there might be a logistics risk, but at least the market is there, like really just begging for the product that you're making.
I want to bring Reto in here because you're already selling this project. You said, I think the Netherlands, you said, was your largest market. Can you just tell us a little bit about getting to that point?
Okay. Yes, we started development in Switzerland, not knowing that the Netherlands is such a good business place for us, because the technology has started there 20 years ago. In Switzerland, it was quite a new field. So first of all, we had to raise the awareness of the technicians, the sanitary planners, and the architects, that hot water is using a lot of energy, and we can do something against that, because often people think, well, showering, that's like a commodity, you can't do anything, and nobody thought about recycling the heat of the wastewater. So after the Netherlands, now we start in Germany. That's also a very important market for us, but we had to wait for 8 years to get the drinking water certification. So we started 8 years ago with this process, and because we were not that important, they waited for a long time until we could convince them that it makes sense, because drinking water certification is key to us to start business in new markets.
Yeah. Kristen, I want to bring you in because Sathi's been around for a little while, and you make biodegradable and compostable sanitary pads. And my question really is, access to hygiene products in India is already very challenging. What made you decide to take that extra step and say, we want this to be a really sustainable manufacturing process, we want to make sure the local community is actually involved in this, rather than just say, there is a big enough public health challenge, we're going to just do that, to take on this extra step?
Yeah, thanks. I think so. We started looking at the issue of lack of access, and that is definitely a big issue in India. Only 36% of women have access to menstrual hygiene products.
Sorry, was that 36%?
Yes, and that's today. When we started, it was lower. But I guess at this point, at the point when we started, we also saw this as a long-term need, and therefore having a long-term solution or a more holistic solution was going to make sense, because it's not something where you provide the product once and then everybody's happy, but you need to provide it consistently over the long term. And if it's a single-use plastic product, which is the cheapest option available, providing that over the long term will create more of a plastic pollution problem, and we didn't see it justified that we could say, well, we're addressing lack of access, but we're ultimately going to create a plastic pollution problem. So we wanted to see how could we address both of these with a more sustainable solution that would last in the long run. And in doing that, I mean, kind of looking at it from a more systems level approach, we were able to see, you know, how can it be upcycled even in rural communities and the benefits. So our first pilot we did in Jharkhand in India, and a lot of women really liked the fact that the product would degrade and wouldn't be just strewn about in the community and left out for all to see. So it kind of had dual benefits there as well.
Let's see, if you work with small companies to help them assess their carbon emissions, can you just tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that companies face when maybe they're, you know, hearing what's going on here, they know the winds are changing, they know they're going to be asked to be part of these transition plans, where they're finding their emissions are highest and how they can look to reduce them?
Yeah, sure. I think we've had two sets of problems depending on the timeline of our startup, because initially we were fully focused on eco-friendly entrepreneurs and businesses, and they were our key niche target. And for them, we were battling, you know, a lot of greenwashing marketing practices and other issues, which for these businesses it matters to them, the marketing side of it. But you know, like without the actual data involved, it's quite, I would say, greenwashing again, right? And then later on, as we moved further into our pilot program, a lot of regular businesses started approaching us, and suddenly there's a change in the kind of concerns that we have working with regular businesses. It would be one, of course, the cost suddenly becomes a major factor for these businesses, because sustainability is more of a long-term path, and it's not just for the businesses, it's for every government and large enterprise. However, for the small businesses, just getting out of COVID, and with the pandemic already making it so stressful with the prices, raw material prices and everything going up, which is cutting into their, you know, that room of like investing into something they might actually, you know, want to do something about. But so that's where we had to sort of rethink our strategy and sort of come up with one with potentially the LEPs and the city councils to provide a free dashboard for these businesses as well.
So as you said, so the concern was that it would require too much upfront investment to become sustainable, or even to look into how they can do that.
I think the concern was more about how much of voluntary investment would be going into it, which is not regulated by the government or which is not prescribed by the government. And I think the government needs to take a cautionary approach, of course, because the businesses are already strained as it is. But however, looking at the long-term goals of UK, more than 95% of UK businesses are small businesses, and they contribute to more than half of the UK's revenue. So they do play an integral role, and customers do want the businesses that they, you know, buy from and products they consume to be more ethically sourced and environmentally conscious. So,
I wanted to bring you in, Edward, because the fashion industry is obviously taking part in this conversation too. But to your point, you know, you're based here. The work you do is in India. A lot of countries have international supply chains. How do they need to think about the way they are accounting for their carbon, accounting for their emissions, so that we don't have this problem where of like an unfair accounting system where certain countries end up with all the emissions on their books, even though the products are being purchased in developed markets which have the wealth to kind of go about this better?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that kind of drives me nuts every time that we hear. I think a lot of European countries, and UK included, are super guilty of this, is our carbon emissions stop at our borders. But a lot of the products we consume are manufactured elsewhere. That's kind of why I got into this. I was super fascinated from an engineering background into the raw materials, like who's mining the metals that go into your smartphone, who's farming the cotton that goes into your clothes. Part of the work that we're doing is looking at what is the data that you need to prove the impact of the garments you're making, for example, and then providing it in a way so that the supply chain can actually use it to account for their carbon or account for their impacts in water withdrawals or chemical emissions. And part of this change is we need legislation to force large companies to disclose this data, because until that comes in, then this data is essentially worthless. When it comes in, then it's data, and then we can use it to inform our decisions. So that's kind of why I got into this.
So I wanted to bring you in, Edward, because the fashion industry is obviously taking part in this conversation too. But to your point, you know, you're based here. A lot of countries have international supply chains. How do they need to think about the way they are accounting for their carbon, accounting for their emissions, so that we don't have this problem where of like an unfair accounting system where certain countries end up with all the emissions on their books, even though the products are being purchased in developed markets,
it's worth a lot, and we can use it to leverage a sustainable transition in a lot of material-based supply chains.
Yeah, I think also importantly, we did a session earlier today about supply chains too, and this idea of a just transition so that you don't cut out suppliers in emerging markets because the energy grid is less green there, or because it seems harder to get the data that is now being asked of you to prove your emissions and that stuff. On that point of policy, Reto, I mean, we talked a little bit before about the building regulation changing and how that can really improve the work that your company does, because it's going to require, architects and building planners to think more about how to use heat energy. And to be honest, I've never given it much thought myself, this idea of waste heat energy and all that time I spend in the shower trying to get that temperature right could actually become much more efficient.
Yeah, I think as long as we are not accountable in the building codes or so, it's quite hard for us, because then we are just an extra cost for the landlords. Because, but when we are, or when you need some extra points in terms of efficiency to get building permission, then it's quite a super easy thing to integrate such device as because otherwise we are just extra costs, and then it's not very attractive for the landlords. So we are looking for flat fees renting system as well, because then it's integrated the energy bills. So that's a big issue for us.
Great. I want to come to audience questions in a few moments, but first I want to ask you all the same question, which is, there's been 2 weeks of sessions going on over in the Blue Zone. What are the kinds of policy changes you would want to see that would make it a little bit easier in the industry that you work in to continue to grow, to really get your products out there, because they're all so innovative already, but it sounds like one of the challenges is growing that. So I don't mind who would like to start. Everyone's looking at you, Florence.
Yeah, all heads turned. Well, a lot of things are actually happening already that are in our favor. For example, the UK has now increased its ethanol standard to E10. It was E5 until 2 months ago. There's also phasing out of certain very toxic chemicals in products where our bio-based inputs would be a very good substitute. So yeah, I think these things are already playing into our cards. A higher tax on fossil-derived raw materials would certainly help those new bio-derived products get into the market sooner, because the fossil fuel industry is still getting huge subsidies, and at the beginning of the industry, say 150 years ago, they were getting so much. So now when people are saying, oh, we don't want to pay a green premium, it's like, well, at the moment, you're actually paying a very polluting premium. As a whole economy, we're still subsidizing fossil fuels, and I think that's what we need to stop doing.
I think from my side, some of the most fascinating sessions during these last couple of weeks has been around the concept of true cost accounting, right? Like there's such a big hidden cost of food, not only in this country, but across Europe as well. And that hidden cost is almost always paid for by the environment in some way, right? We take for granted how cheap food is actually in this country, even though it has to be grown somewhere else, shipped over using refrigerated containers, and then we get it. So I think the strength of the supermarkets in this country, and it's really the farmers themselves that are suffering, because it becomes a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. So I think some of the ideas that I've heard around true cost accounting of the cost of food is going to make a really huge impact.
Before I go to you, Steve, the thing in the UK at the moment is that we are about to see quite a lot of food price inflation. So I'm just kind of curious as to how you think that's going to affect yourself when you're saying we need investment, we want to grow bigger. Is that going to make that easier or harder? Because I imagine this process at the moment, it's still not super economic to grow things that aren't, say, like basil.
It's a good question. I think the interesting thing is that our entire global food system has been built with just-in-time supply chains in mind. So the pricing only works if just-in-time supply chains work. But with Brexit, with COVID, even that Suez Canal thing, we all experienced just-in-time supply chains breaking down. So I think it's probably right that the cost of food does go up to a certain extent, but that it's not the farmer that is paying for that, it's not the end consumer that is paying for that, but it's the corporates in the middle that are understanding the pressures that both ends face?
Yeah, I think for us, really, the key is the policy that's set out by the government. And one of the really driving factors was when the local city governments actually introduced net zero policy mandates on contractors, government contractors. And I see that moving forward, done so by the larger corporates and everyone to bring their supply chain partners in line with their vision, so to speak. So I think at the same time, the government shouldn't impose this cost on these small businesses. It should be some form of taxpayer or some kind of mechanism that the government needs to bring in so that for the companies who do have the drive to move towards sustainability has more access to funding and other opportunities as well.
I'm actually going to, before I get to you, I'm going to go to Reto, because in my head he's in the middle.
It's up to me.
Yes.
Sorry. My biggest wish is actually that the builders are a bit more open-minded and that they integrate new stuff, and because it's not rocket science what we are doing, it's just basic, and also the governments, they should just accept that waste heat is also a very green source of energy. And if energy pricing are as high as they actually should be, then we are very competitive with our recycled heat energy then. So it's all about balancing the scheme that green solutions are competitive as the energy from the old system.
Mm-hmm.
I want to second both what Florence said and what Veda said, I guess. So from the tax perspective, one thing that a lot of people are talking about is that we should remove the pink tax, or the tax on period products. And that does make a lot of sense, but at the same time, if you just remove the tax as a manufacturer, you're paying for that tax in raw materials, because we don't get any there's no subsidy on the raw materials that we use. So if there is some kind of subsidy for sustainable materials, then that can actually eliminate the tax, as opposed to it becoming an expense for the end consumer. The second thing is kind of around looking at solutions that with a more kind of holistic lens. So for our solution, we did kind of put in as many impacts as possible, whether you look at it from a health perspective, environmental perspective, trying to have more women employment, et cetera. And if we're taking all of those into consideration, then we're able to make much more impact with just one process, manufacturing process and product. So then, we fit into multiple kind of government initiatives, if you will, but then do we get the same support to scale up and make this kind of at that same level as other initiatives? So I think looking at it from both perspectives is good.
So rather than double down on, I guess, things like reporting emissions beyond our borders, I think maybe on the front end of the startup and research side, for companies that do fall in between the cracks of local priorities, we're addressing a material that everyone enjoys, I'd hope. But the thing is, agricultural subsidies in this country go to produce grown in this country, and then fashion incentives will be towards fashion companies in this country. We have to operate here because some of the largest fashion companies are based in Europe and the UK, but obviously operations are global. And if countries like the UK want to be global leaders driving a sustainable agenda, then they have to fund research that will affect sustainability in other geographies as well.
I have more questions, but I'd like to see if there are any audience questions first, and we'll take, I think there should be a microphone somewhere. It's coming from behind you, sir, yes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hanuman Das from a charity called Go Dharmic, also based in Gujarat, in India. So last year we cycled from Ahmedabad to Dandi in Gujarat. It's the route which Mahatma Gandhi walked for his Salt March. And we did it for the environment, to try and raise awareness. And we were shocked in that state where everybody is growing tobacco. Almost uniformly across the state, as we cycled 500 kilometers, every farm was growing tobacco, and we stopped and calculated the cost, the earning to the farmers. We were talking to them and calculating per packet in the US, or everybody that traveled from the UK, how much does the farmer get, or the owner of that land per packet? And we calculated it was about 7 to 10 pence out of a 20-pound pack that we see on the streets here in the UK that was going to the farmer. So my question is, in that situation, what are we doing, are you doing to account for the person who's at the root creating, the farmer on the ground, the worker on the ground, whether that be a female entrepreneur who can sell this product or sanitary pad, or, you know, at the core of it, at the root, and including them in the decision making and the route to a more equitable source of success, because those people, I feel, don't have a choice. They have to produce whatever they can earn. And if 7p is the most that they can earn out of a packet, it's an unfair global system that we need to address and take responsibility for.
Thank you. Were there any other questions before I round? Oh yeah, you can clap. That's allowed. If not, I will ask Edward and then Kristen to take that question.
Yeah. So this is absolutely critical in the way that we think about how we source materials. So what we're looking at least what we're trying to do, is a demand-driven approach to things like cotton farming. So the market, there are lots of different ways in which cotton can be sourced, from large farms in America that can pretty much drive their sales, and they can control the kind of price a bit better. But then we have the most vulnerable farmers across the states in India that are subject to basically market volatility, brands pulling out from organic or premium incentives. And what we're working towards is creating basically bilateral agreements with collectivized organizations of farmers to make sure that the offtake for anything that they invest in is guaranteed. And the only way that we're really going to shift this is to really build simpler supply chains where visibility on the ground is basically built. And what's cool right now, which wasn't possible before, is in places like Gujarat, you've got mass connectivity. That's much easier to get a continuous dialogue with farmers and make sure they're continuously visible. Supply chains up till now have left everyone at the base completely invisible. I mean, even in the UK, you don't see enough what's really happening on an agricultural level. And that's part of the shift and the change. Because, yeah, the price asymmetry is mad. And until we have that kind of cultural realignment where we celebrate farmers as much as we do fashion designers, then it's not going to change.
I guess to add an extra question before we go to Kristen,
Yeah.
The difference between being a new company that can do this from the get-go to, say, have a much simpler supply chain versus an established company that's wanting to do this.
Yeah, I mean, so let's be real. Cotton has never really come from a good place in terms of the way that it's sourced. And we are facing an incredible challenge because we've got to scale what we're doing, and then big brands will also have to kind of reverse and unpick. So I think the main thing also to think is that there's not going to be one way to do this, and to try and push different initiatives. What we're doing is looking particularly at areas struggling with climate volatility, and that's where we're trying to tie these agreements over time, because you need more of a project mindset around the infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're doing is we're working with farmers to use up their agri-waste. So in that sense, looking at as many ways to reuse any agri-waste that they already have and be able to pay them for that as well. So instead of them just kind of disposing it or giving it to us for free, we're paying some kind of price for it so that we can maintain this over the long term. So basically working to provide sources of additional income additionally to whatever plants that they're growing. Right now we started with banana fiber and bamboo fiber because bamboo grows like a weed, and because also with banana there's already India is one of the largest exporters of banana in the world, and so they already have plenty of plantations, and it's more of a matter of using up the raw material from there.
Great. Florence, I want to bring you in because this is something that sounds familiar to like the future potential of what Exea can do in terms of using those raw materials and involving farmers in the process.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the challenges but also opportunities of using biomass instead of petroleum is that biomass is a lot more distributed. So oil comes out of a well somewhere in Saudi Arabia, biomass grows, India is a huge agricultural state, Ukraine grows loads of wheat, it's across the globe, loads of countries have the potential to use their locally available raw materials, waste materials, for example, as well, from the agricultural sector. So I think once we're able to establish these new supply chains that keep a lot more things in the local economy, the local farmer will benefit a lot more from it as well, because it's not just going to get shipped off to the other end of the planet. It's actually going to be used in the local economy and decreases the need to import things from outside. So yeah, for us, it's maybe a decade away to actually start thinking about that sector, but it's certainly something that is an opportunity in the bio-based sector.
Well, a decade away, unless we have any investors sitting in the audience today who are inspired by this conversation. Let me ask if there are any more audience questions, otherwise I'll turn to a question about energy sources, which I'm going to direct. Oh, did you want to?
I'd just like to add on to that, although not from my startup's perspective. However, I come from Kerala, a small state in India as well. And we have an interesting initiative called Kudumbashri back home. And it's a women-led initiative to craft handicrafts, products from coir, from coconut trees and palm trees and so on. And right now, I think it's seen as a premium that you need to pay to get those products. And however, you get a better quality and a longer lifetime with it. However, when you bring in carbon emissions and the kind of repercussions of using plastic in mass producing doormats and other things, you suddenly see that, these are way more cheaper to the environment and to us in general. And I think that's where India and like other developing parts of the world as well can definitely bring in sustainability to improve its own local systems as well.
Well, Reto talked about using waste heat energy to kind of power his invention. I wanted to ask Chris and Florence to talk a little bit about the energy sources needed for the work you do. Obviously, vertical farming, I think to people will immediately think of that as being a very energy-intensive process, and how you go about making sure that is sustainable and doesn't actually end up contributing to emissions. And then Florence, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it takes to turn biomass into the product you need it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the key criticisms of vertical farming that it actually uses a lot of energy. In our company, we use 100% renewable energy, and we've done that from the very beginning. We do a really cool thing where all of our plants actually grow at night fundamentally. We turn off all of our lights between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. because that's when energy is most expensive. And we work very, very closely with our energy provider, where we have, sometimes half-hour notice of how energy prices are fluctuating. I do a lot of kind of circular design thinking, particularly around this area. And the medium to long-term vision of vertical farming is really one of co-location. So if we can think about, it's taken a lot of system design thinking to get the food system in the place that it is now, to the detriment of the environment, right? And it's going to take a lot of system thinking to get us in a better position. So the best example that I can give here is a co-located vertical farm with an anaerobic digester, for example. An anaerobic digester can consume all of the organic waste from the vertical farm, of which there's a significant amount, and in return, the vertical farm can consume power, waste heat, and waste CO2. We pump CO2 into our farm because that's what plants need. So by thinking more holistically about different sustainable infrastructures, we're able to create a very holistic, circular food generation, power generation, and power storage infrastructure that addresses some of the challenges of power intensity.
So yeah, of course, our chemical process consumes energy. The there are existing processes that achieve a similar thing. That's how today's paper is made, or our existing cellulose-based textile fibers. What the industry currently is doing is they're burning a part of the wood to produce that energy. So it's actually non-fossil carbon that gets emitted. So it's, in that sense, as far as it goes, carbon neutral. And that's certainly also an option for us. There's also very large industrial versions of the Retto's invention. So this heat exchanger, these things are used on a huge scale in industry. And it's of course also something that we're doing. So reusing all the heat that we produce in one part of the process to heat up other parts of the process. You can do a lot of energy savings there. And then, yeah, once we look at having large-scale plants, using local energy sources is of course part of the solution there.
Great. We have 1 minute left, so this is really the final chance to ask any questions about these different companies, although I imagine you'll be around a little bit if someone did want to follow up. If there are no more, I'm just going to ask one final question to Retto there, and thank you for joining us from Switzerland, just about this question of making sure that buildings are part of the emissions conversation more and more. I think when I think the statistic that 40% of emissions come from buildings, I was normally thinking about the heating systems, the cooling systems. I'm kind of curious, as you've done this work to think about how you can use waste heat energy, are there other examples of how we should think about what we can do to innovate buildings to be much more sustainable?
In general, your question. So as an architect, we are used to, or when I made the apprenticeship as a draftsman, I drew the building with insulation of about, I don't know, 8 to 10 centimeters. Now these days, it went up to 30 centimeters. So there are a lot of regulations about the building envelope. We use triple glazing, so I think the envelope is now perfectly built, or at least in Switzerland. But as I said before, I think that the last hole is the wastewater. But I think in general, if we could export these kind of construction to some emerging markets or so. Yesterday I had some conversation with sustainable or a green building label, and they are thinking about exporting their knowledge to emerging markets, that they could build their houses much better. I think then it makes a lot of more sense when we build on a global basis a bit better houses than if we would put, instead of 30 centimeters, 35 centimeters on Swiss houses. That doesn't make sense. So just improve the general building stock, and this would help a lot.
Great. Well, we are out of time, so I just want to say thank you to Florence, Chris, Nassif, Retto, Kristen, and Edward for joining us, and congratulations on being part of this program. It's really lovely to see you all.
Thank you.